Hey guys, I'm currently away on holiday for Gamescom at the moment, so today's video will be hosted by another YouTuber called the Orange Hatter, who also makes a lot of MMORPG content, with my personal favourites being his discussion videos in which he dissects different elements of MMOs, such as combat, dungeons, progression, and difficulty. So I'd highly suggest checking out his channel and subscribing to him if you enjoy his content. Enjoy the video.
Throughout many years of playing MMORPGs, I've had a very odd opinion when it comes to RNG, random number generation. For a time, I was really against the idea of things like token systems to help with RNG. For a while, I thought that RNG should be removed entirely from MMORPGs, and we should just instead have currencies. Fortunately, though, I'm a lot smarter than my past self, which admittedly isn't really saying much, so I wanted to talk about RNG because it's been changing over the last couple of years. Big games have been changing how they view RNG, and smaller free-to-play games have been inventing new ways to apply RNG. Some of these have been really good, some of these have been not so good. Like, not so good at all. I'm looking at you, Madam Faye. So that all leads to a question. In this weird modern world of intricate boss designs and artifact weapons and loot currencies, is there still a place for good old-fashioned RNG and MMOs? More importantly, what does that place look like? RNG can be really controversial these days. Getting stuck on a quest for an hour because a quest item just refuses to drop, not getting that essential upgrade for weeks on end, having your tank go down to like an unlucky string of crits and crushes, or some other boss mechanics for some sort of huge, unneeded wipe. All of this is kind of terrible, and what's worse is you often feel entirely helpless against it. RNG might be fair, but it's also like super cruel and indiscriminate, which can be good sometimes and awful others. Often people don't really remember their good streaks, but the bad streaks stick out in your mind. Just think of the last time you had to work your ass off to get something because it just refused to drop. That's why RNG kind of has had a negative reputation. So less RNG is good, right? I think that like a lot of things, RNG is a tool to be used, and the place that it's used and the context that it's used in matters a lot. So where is that place? What is that context? When I think of RNG, I immediately think of loot drops, item drops, stuff dropping from things, whether it's new upgrades for my character or quest items so I can hurry up and progress. Those are the two things that immediately come to my mind. I don't know if they come to your mind. If I did, that would be kind of weird. There could be some frustration in loot drops. I spent 6 weeks trying to get that stupid axe from the butcher in High Mall in World of Warcraft back when I raided. Gore-Tusk livers were infamous for just not existing. I mean, I've been basically camping the time-lost Proto-Drake for 8 years. On the other hand, RNG can be a really big motivator, or at least the rewards behind it can. I go back to those raids because I want that axe so I can go to Blackrock Foundry and kick some ass. I camp that Proto-Drake because it's like the last one for like my big collection of Proto-Drakes. In that sense, RNG and the knowledge that one day your number is going to come up and you're going to get that thing and you're going to feel so friggin' awesome, it kind of makes it a good thing. In fact, that drive could be so incredibly powerful that Blizzard has built business models on it. I mean, I try and get some Overwatch in every day so that every day I can unlock a crate. I call it practice, but really, I'm shooting for that RNG because I want those nice legendary skins. It's a motivator, it drives you. That gambler's high takes over and you just need to keep playing. It's what makes casinos so incredibly dangerous. I'm not the only person who thinks that, right? I'm not the only person? I really hope I'm not the only person who thinks that. So RNG can be as frustrating as it is fun, as awesome as it is awful. But how do we stay on the fun and awesome side of that spectrum and not slip into the incredibly frustrating, oh my god, my tank just got crushed 3 times in a row and is now dead and we're wiping side of the spectrum? There's quite a few games that have done it really right, and quite a few games that have done it really wrong. Terribly wrong. Back in Warlords of Draenor, World of Warcraft implemented an interesting new way it does gear. When a piece of gear drops, you get a piece from a quest or something like that, you have a chance of getting an upgraded version of it. Either it can be Warforged and have bonus item levels, Titanforged and have like a ridiculous number of bonus eye levels, or you could have an extra tertiary stat, or an extra socket. All of these little random bonuses that appeared on gear. This is interesting because endgame loot suddenly had an extra level of RNG added to it that improved that loot. And I think it's actually a pretty smart system of adding RNG to a system that already had some RNG associated with it without drawing out the bad parts of RNG. If you get a basic item from a raid boss or a dungeon boss, that's fine, you still get a basic item of what you were expecting. But if you get a Warforged or a Titan Forged item, it's a little bonus that makes that item feel better, actually. This is a type of, I guess you could call it positive RNG, RNG that only goes up from a basic point that you're already expecting. You can only get a better piece, you can't get a worse piece through the Warforged system, so it's kind of a smart way to do it. It adds a nice little incentive to doing raids as opposed to buying things with currency, which can't wind up being upgraded. But let's take a look at something that was kind of based on the same concept of getting gear that's a little bit better sometimes randomly, and see how, using RNG, it can kind of fall flat. I've always viewed crafting as a way to minimize the inherent RNG of MMORPGs, a way to fill slots that you might not have had filled in raids through luck or what have you. Some games have crafted gear as the best in the game, while others just have crafted gear as a way to supplement the gearing process for other things. But sometimes this doesn't work, besides Warlords of Draenor. When WildStar unveiled its big crafting revamp sometime last year just before the big free-to-play changeover, I was actually kind of excited. I was really interested in the system. How it works is when you go to craft an item, there are certain elementally attuned slots, attuned to one of WildStar's 6 elements, and each of these elements has certain stats associated with it. So when you craft, you are randomly getting different slots, which you then use to assign stat points to the item you're crafting. If the stat point you assign to that slot matches the element, awesome! It works just fine. You can even overcharge it to get a little bit more of that stat out of it. That's a big bonus. On the other hand, if it doesn't match the element of that slot, you wind up having to reduce the amount of stats that you're getting in order to prevent the item from failing or just not being craftable altogether. Like any other MMORPG, in WildStar, certain classes require certain stats to be optimized to play better, and WildStar is nothing if not a game about playing optimized. There's a lot of really hard stuff in this game, and having good gear with good stats is super important. So let's do a hypothetical example here. Let's pretend that I'm a healer in WildStar, which I actually am, and I'm crafting a headpiece for myself, and that headpiece has 3 slots. Now I need my 3 core stats: multi-hit, intensity, and focus pool. What these stats do isn't really relevant, but that's the 3 big stats for my class. That means if I want to get an optimal craft and have a good item, I need a water slot, a logic slot, and a life slot. So each of the 3 slots there have a 1 in 6 chance of being the slot that I need. That means if I want to get an optimal build with all 3 of the slots that I absolutely need in order to optimize my class, I have a 1 in 216 chance of having an optimal craft. To put that in a little bit of perspective, you are roughly 3 times more likely to get the invincible mount from Arthas than you are to get an optimal craft on that headpiece. This wouldn't be as bad if you didn't have to undercharge on even 1 stat mismatch, but even 1 stat mismatch on most power cores will push you clean to the point where you can't even craft the item, which means no matter what, you're looking at dropping the item's stats below what's normal for the item level, which kinda sucks. That's not what I'd call like super good odds to get an optimal item, but even worse, if I decide to overcharge, which is the whole point of getting an optimal item setup, I have to increase the failure chance, which adds another layer of RNG. I could get this 1 in 216 optimal item and then fail the craft, losing it completely. There is an incredible amount of RNG in this system. RNG in getting ideal slots, RNG in failure chance. It's kind of friggin' crazy. This could be made a lot better if you could pay, say, a resource cost to guarantee certain slots, but there's no way to determine which slots are going to be which in advance. It's always RNG. It's why I don't like it. It's why it's not fun. You feel kind of helpless at the whims of random numbers to get the item you want to craft. WildStar's a really good game. It's not quite perfect. The way I've seen crafting in a lot of MMORPGs over the years is a way to guarantee items, a way to mitigate the RNG of dungeon drops. There are other ways to do this, such as reputation factions, that might work better or worse depending on how they're implemented, but crafting has always kind of been that staple way of ensuring you have items. It's probably the most common way you can get gear without having to have it drop in a dungeon. To have a system like this that's supposed to help manage RNG amplify the RNG problem doesn't work. But we get it, RNG is really bad for items. What about the content itself? For years now, Blizzard has been on this crusade to reduce RNG when it comes to PvE, and that kind of actually makes sense. A lot of PvE encounters, you want to make sure that you're on top of the mechanics, and it's really hard to be on top of the mechanics when the mechanics are incredibly random. Things like critical strikes from bosses and crushing blows, which could insta-gib a tank and immediately end an attempt, kinda suck. To break it down, a crushing blow is an attack that would sometimes proc on an enemy that was 3 levels or higher above you that dealt 150% normal damage. Kind of like a crit, but kind of worse because you could crit a crushing blow, which sucked. This meant that in order to raid back in the day, tanks had to become uncrittable and uncrushable. They had to be able to push those off the table using avoidance, which was not super duper easy, but it had to be done if you wanted to raid. Nothing sucked more than your tank just kind of exploding into a mess of gore because he got a couple of bad crushing blows in a row. Blizzard effectively removed this in Wrath of the Lich King by making it so enemies had to be 4 levels or more above you in order to crushing blow you, which meant that raid bosses didn't do it anymore. They are considered 3 levels above you. So that kind of solved that problem. This is the kind of bad RNG and MMOs I'm talking about that doesn't really have a place anymore. Being able to just instantly have your tank explode because he's a little bit undergeared is a little bit harsh and cruel and ridiculous, and having almost no way to deal with this other than just putting more stuff on your tank also sucks. But does this mean that PvE does not need RNG, that RNG should be removed entirely? I don't think so, but as I've mentioned before with items, you just need to be smart about it. To kind of illustrate what I mean by this, I'm going to compare 2 raid bosses from World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. Sindragosa from ICC and Melusine from the Second Binding Coil of Bahamut. Sindragosa first uses RNG to select 2 players in your raid to turn into ice blocks. These ice blocks are essential to surviving the fight, as the rest of the raid needs to hide behind them to line of sight her Frost Bomb ability and avoid a bunch of needless raid damage. Then break the 3 players out before they suffocate. This is kind of unfun RNG, especially for the players who are selected. You probably aren't excited if you're one of those players. You're probably a little annoyed. Not only do you get to be removed from the fight for around 20 seconds, but if the raid messes up, you're dead. All of this with no control over how you deal with it. This is kind of unfun RNG, as if you get selected for this, you're probably not super excited for it. You're even probably a little bit annoyed. I mean, you move into position, you get frozen, you spend the next 30 seconds looking at the inside of an ice block model until your raid breaks you out. I mean, if they don't screw the pooch and let you suffocate. Not only are you sitting around bored while you're stuck in that ice block, but you also probably feel pretty helpless about it. There's nothing you can really do. Once you get targeted, you move into position, and that's it. You have no agency over the RNG. You have no control over what happens to you. The RNG just kind of happens. You kind of feel screwed by it, I guess. Now let's contrast this with a boss who uses what is essentially the same mechanic in a much more interesting way. Final Fantasy XIV has a boss in the Second Binding Coil of Bahamut named Melusine. She does something similar to Sindragosa, where she selects 3 party members at random, 1 healer, 1 tank, and 1 DPS, and gives them a debuff. This debuff causes them to fire a cone when it expires that petrifies anybody who's caught in it, friend or foe. It's called Cursed Voice. She then targets a 4th player and hits them with a different debuff, which works the same way, but petrifies any player within line of sight when it expires. This one's called Cursed Shriek. Players who get the cone debuff now need to use it on ads that spawn around the room, so that the player who gets the line of sight debuff can hide behind one of these new petrified ads, so the rest of the raid doesn't get petrified by the big shriek. This might sound a little bit confusing and odd, and you might be trying to put this together in your head to see how it works, but it is essentially the same mechanic. 3 players are given a debuff, which they must use to create cover to prevent a raid wiping ability. But in my opinion, Melusine felt a lot more interesting and fun than Sindragosa. Why is that? And I swear it had nothing to do with the fact that whoever voiced Sindragosa did a great job of making my ears bleed. Betrays you! When you're given the debuff on Sindragosa, you kind of feel stuck. You get into position, you freeze in your ice block, and you sit around looking at the inside of an ice block for about 30 seconds. Whereas with Melusine, you feel like you have a lot more agency over the situation you're in. You can still wipe the raid if you mess up with the Melusine debuff. In fact, you can do that pretty easily, but you feel like you've got a lot more agency and control on how you deal with it, as opposed to just getting frozen and hoping that your raid is quick enough to break you out before you suffocate. The 4th person who gets the Shrieking debuff has just a simple task of dumping the debuff behind cover and then returning to fight the boss, while the people who get the Cone debuff have a simple task of freezing one of the enemies to create cover. It feels like you have more options when you go into this. You have control. You can mitigate the effects of this RNG. Yes, you've been put into an unfortunate situation, but you can use it to your advantage. You can turn it around, and if you're smart, you can avoid the negative effects of it. Unlike Syndragosa, where two people are going to be locked in those ice blocks no matter what, it feels a lot more helpless, a lot less fun. Or it could be like a giant troll and just stand there and petrify the entire raid.
Hey, Neela, go hide!
Anila, go hide! Anila! Zanduin! Travis!
Go hide!
Why?
So to go back to the question I kind of asked at the beginning of this, is there a place for RNG in modern MMOs? I would say absolutely yes. But I think it's time we left behind the bad RNG. The one that feels arbitrary, the one that feels forced, and the one that leaves the player powerless against the will of the dice roll. That's not fun RNG. RNG is at its best when it's creative and interesting, when it makes players feel empowered instead of making them feel like they got lucky, or worse, that they got unlucky. It works best when its effects can be used to supplement an encounter, when it feels like part of a boss instead of some mechanic that singles out victims for additional punishment. Because the downsides of RNG are not fun. Getting essential items for progression doesn't feel like winning, but not getting them certainly feels like losing. And in games, feeling really is everything. Great example of this ingenuity in practice, Final Fantasy XIV just released an entire dungeon that is completely built on RNG. It acts more like a roguelike than it does a regular dungeon, but it's super duper fun. It's ideas like this that really show what you can do with RNG in MMOs these days. It's ideas like this that make it a little bit more interesting. It's ideas like this that show that RNG still has a firm place in MMORPGs. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go camp Storm Peaks for a few hours. Oh, hey there! My name is Matt the Orange Adder, and thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. And a huge shout out and thanks to TheLazyPeon for letting me come on and do this video. I'm hugely excited to have been able to do a video for all of you amazing people out there, big fans of TheLazyPeon. I'm a huge fan of his as well, so stoked! If you're a big fan of MMORPGs and stuff like that, you should click that subscribe button right down there because that is TheLazyPeon and he's awesome for that kind of stuff. And if you liked me talking about things that make MMORPGs tick, I do that a couple times a week over at my channel, The Orange Hatter. You should check it out. But thank you very much for watching, and I hope that you all have a great one.